Okay, this chapter, chapter 4, is about energy usage in the cell and where the energy comes from. Now you see these diatoms here. They are photosynthetic plankton, often eaten by whales and all kinds of other critters in the ocean. And you can see by the color that they have photosynthetic qualities to them. They do photosynthesis in the ocean and create the energy and the food for themselves. Even though you eat food and you know that food becomes energy, the food does not directly become energy in your body. It needs to go through a process, which we will learn about later in this chapter. Now you may recall that carbohydrates, of the 4 biomolecules, carbohydrates are the biomolecule that provide most of the energy that you use in all your cells. Now, by the way, I just want to say that if a cell is unable to produce energy even for a fairly short amount of time, that cell is going to end up dying, which is why it's so important for you to continue to breathe, because that helps your body turn the food that you eat into the energy that you need in your cell. So you see at the bottom of this picture here, this slide, here's a glucose molecule, remember, with the 6 sides, carbon in every corner, 1 sticking up on the quote-unquote roof, and an oxygen in one corner, and an H and OH, or a water molecule basically, so carbohydrate, a water molecule attached to every one of the carbons. And if you look at this top picture here, this is a characteristic starch molecule which has several glucose molecules attached together, and sometimes there's branching. And starch is the way that plants store the carbohydrates that they make from their photosynthesis efforts in the sun. The energy molecule of that your body uses is called ATP. And for those of you who like advanced information, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So that remember that tri, we're going to talk about that in a minute. ATP is an energy molecule that is fully charged, like a fully charged battery. And you can see the ATP molecule down here. So your body uses this ATP in a cycle. So it uses it and cuts off one of these phosphate groups to produce the energy needed in your cell. Now it's got one less phosphate, so instead of being a triphosphate, it now becomes a diphosphate. And I hope you can recall that Di in biology means 2. So diphosphate. This is adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. This is like a rechargeable battery that you have used all the charge up, or most of the charge up. So your body takes ADP, this uncharged battery, adds energy from the food that you eat, which basically adds a phosphate group onto the ADP, making it now triphosphate. And we'll talk about why ATP has so much energy, whereas ADP has a lot less, in the next slide. All right, this is the cycle of ATP. It goes from a fully charged ATP molecule, which has energy available to the cell. The process of releasing that energy, or plugging it in, is to cut off one of these phosphate groups, which then provides the energy to power your cell to do whatever it needs to, and turns your ATP into ADP. And then the cycle continues because your body will take this ADP and recycle it by adding energy to it and pushing another phosphate group on, changing it from only 2 to 3. As you may recall from our biomolecules discussion in Chapter 2, carbohydrates are the molecules that your body uses the most often to turn into energy. It's much easier to take a glucose molecule, which you can cut off from a carbohydrate, and send it through the processes necessary to recharge your ADP into ATP. Now, carbohydrates are only stored in your muscles and your liver as glycogen, so you don't have large amounts of carbohydrates hanging out in your body. From each glucose molecule, you can get up to 36 ATP recharged from one glucose molecule. Alright, here's your chemical structure of ATP, and let's explain what this is. So you've got your adenosine right here, which is always attached to a 5-sided sugar, and then your 3 phosphate groups. Now the phosphate group is not just a phosphate, but it's a phosphate surrounded by oxygen atoms. So P with 4 oxygen atoms around it. And oxygen, as you recall, is a pig for electrons. So oxygen tends to have a negative charge on it, making it extremely polar. Now remember what happens when you put 2 magnets together and you try to put the negative side of one magnet to the negative side of another magnet. Remember how they repel each other. So here you've got this negative phosphate group here and this negative phosphate group here, and just getting them close enough to bond takes an enormous amount of energy from your body to make this bond, to force that covalent bond between these 2 highly negative molecules that want to repel each other. Alright, now you have 2 phosphate groups, highly negative, and you take a third highly negative phosphate group and try to add it on to the other 2. Well, the energy in this bond is even more, there's even more energy in this bond because it takes so much energy for your body to press this third phosphate group into having a covalent bond with the other 2. So this third phosphate group is fairly almost humming like, oh, I want to get away from these other 2 guys. So of course, as soon as you cut that last bond there, boom, there's a whole bunch of energy available in your cell. Okay, so here this is not quite as unstable, this ADP, as this ATP. So that's why we call this a recharged battery for your cell, because there's so much energy that went into that last bond. Alright, your energy comes from the food you eat. You don't just eat carbohydrates, you also eat lipids, which as you recall are fats, and protein. Alright, so carbohydrates do not store the most calories. They only give you 4 calories per gram. And I want to talk about this table here. You'll notice in your book it says 4 calories per milligram. That's a mistake that the book made. It's actually 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate that you eat. Remember what carbohydrates are? They're anything that grows on a plant, like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, celery. Also, of course, we refine some of our carbohydrates like beets and cane sugar into sugar, and so a lot of times we'll put that together and make a starch like crackers or cookies. Carbohydrates can also be in cereal. So think about corn, wheat, grains, vegetables, sugary snacks, rice crackers, all those are carbohydrates, and the carbohydrate portion of that food that you eat gives you 4 calories that you can turn into energy per gram. Lipids store the most energy, which I think you recall. They have 9 calories per gram. And in addition, in a triglyceride, which are 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol, a triglyceride will be able to produce 146 ATP from a single triglyceride, which is why it's so hard to get rid of the fat in your body, because every single fat molecule has so much energy. You really have to use a lot of energy running and exercising and doing things and thinking and studying in order to use up even the ATP from a single triglyceride. Okay, so, and I think we said before that a person of normal weight has enough fat on their body to provide enough ATP to keep you going for a month without food if you have water available. Finally, there's proteins. Proteins give you 4 calories per gram. Your body is somewhat reluctant to break down protein to make ATP unless you are starving, because your body needs amino acids to make the proteins and repair the various structures in your body. So your body would rather break down fat than proteins to make ATP if you have not eaten enough carbohydrates. By the way, people like Atkins type diets or low carbohydrate type diets because they're hoping to force their body to burn fat if they don't have enough carbohydrates easily available. All organisms on Earth, most organisms on Earth rely on sunlight, either directly or indirectly. Plants, of course, rely on sunlight to turn the energy of the sun into the carbohydrates that they then use in their bodies. And animals or herbivores will eat the plants, getting their energy indirectly from the sun. And then finally, carnivores will eat herbivores, so carnivores get their energy even more indirectly, but from the sun. And as you well know, if something happened to our access to sunlight, we would be unable to survive for very long. Once all the plants are dead and all the stores of food we have around the world are gone and all the animals are gone, well, that's the end. Okay, not every organism gets their energy from sunlight, and not every organism uses photosynthesis as the basis of their ecosystems. Here's a picture of a deep sea vent, maybe a mile or 2 miles under the ocean. Now, deep sea vents, as you may know, are thermal vents, so thermal vents, so hot and sulfuric type energy there's a lot of heat and also sulfur and other chemicals that come up from these deep vents from deep in the ground, from the magma that's heated up deep in the inside the earth. And so these ecosystems use the chemicals that boil up from these deep sea vents, and they use chemicals as the basis of making their carbon molecules or their energy molecules for their bodies. And so there's some sort of a bacteria that can live off of, it's an extremophile that can handle the dark and the cold deep under the ocean, and then the very, very hot if they're quite close to the thermal vent, maybe 700 degrees. Let's see, I think it's Fahrenheit, for example. So these chemical users are called chemosynthesizers, and they use chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis. They use the chemicals such as sulfur that have high energy that come through these vents, and then they use that energy from these chemicals to make their glucose and other carbon-based molecules. So it's somewhat similar to photosynthesis, but instead of using light, they use chemical energy. Now, the only reason there's any light in this picture is that someone's in a deep sea submersible and they're using their headlights to show you this this little colony that's built off of the bacteria that can do chemosynthesis, and then other like tube worms and other kinds of organisms eat that bacteria and have this fun little eco-column way, way deep in the ocean. Thank you for your attention. Have a good weekend.